Let's stop recording and jump into it. All right. Well, good morning, everyone. Welcome. I know it is a gray and rainy day out there, but I'm glad to see you logged in either way. I know we got a little bit of a light crowd today, but I think we got enough to kind of jump into what we're doing here. So I know I was not here on Monday, and I think I sent out the wrong link. So I don't know if how many of you were here, but just a refresher that we're talking about love in this project, this term. What is it? How do we define it? Is it the centerpiece of so many stories and songs and movies and TV shows and all that stuff? And how do different authors, convey it? How do they write about it? What are the kind of literary tools they use to convey their thoughts and feelings? We're going to think about that, talk about all that as we read through two short stories. We're going to start one today. And then eventually your final product is going to be creating some kind of artifact, whether it's, a drawing, a video, an essay, a song, um, about your thoughts and feelings on love and kind of explain, how you did it, why you did it. So, to get us started today, we're going to try and get some background into the first short story we're going to read. And then we're going to see if we can start reading that. And I'll explain what our first checkpoint is going to be for our first progress report, which is coming up. Everything is going to be due, I think, tomorrow, end of the day tomorrow, and then that'll come out next week. All right. So here is the kind of thought for the day that I want to get us started with. All right, which I have on my screen right now. So you can respond in the chat to this question. Whoop, there we go. What kind of sacrifices would you make for a person who mattered to you? So, a person who mattered to you, person you cared about, what kind of sacrifices would you make for them? Take a minute or two, think about this. Put your answer in the chat for me. Oh, excuse me. And you can think however big or however small you want here with this, but what kind of sacrifices would you make for a person who mattered to you? Think about this question, and I want to see your answers in the chat if you can. Thank you very much. Again, thinking about this question right here, what kinds of sacrifices would you make for a person who mattered to you? Think about it. Take another minute and put your answers in the chat when you have them. Thank you very much. So thinking about, the little sacrifices, like would you change your behavior? If your partner doesn't like to waste a lot of water, would you try and stop, running as much water when you do dishes? Something small like that, or it could be something big, like um, would you raise money to pay for medical expenses if they were in the hospital? Would you, some people steal for people they care about. Some people even, um, kill for people that matter to them. Not saying you guys are going to have those same answers, but just giving me an example of how big or how small you can go with this question. So keep thinking about it. take about another like 30 seconds to a minute, and I want to see your answers come into the chat, please. Thank you. All right, let's see if we've come up with anything in the chat. Something from Ayana, which is awesome. Thank you. If it's like a family member or someone I love dearly, I would sacrifice my time, effort, and even a life to them. So yeah, that's a really good one. And I like how you were specific. You know, if it's a family member, somebody that I really really love, I could go from sacrificing my time all the way up to like sacrificing your life maybe, which is obviously the most extreme of circumstances, but that's what some people do. It's a really good one. Thank you, Ayana. Darian, Sammy, Tehran, any thoughts from you guys on that same question? What kind of sacrifices would you make for a person who mattered to you? Anything else you can put in the chat before we move on here? What do we think? Anything else? Just one last check in the chat. Anything they need? Yeah, Darian, I agree. And who else is that? I gotta switch my glasses up here. Take away my life from my mom. Yeah. So obviously we all kind of have seems like we all kind of have people that we thought of, right away. Like I said, if it's a family member, Sammy was saying his mom. So there's always those people that kind of, all bets are off in terms of what we sacrifice. So thank you for those responses, really good ones. The reason we started with that question is because that's what we are going to be talking about when we read our short story. It is called The Gift of the Magi, as you can see up here. Some of you may have heard of it or read it before, but it is a story about love and sacrifice. Right? So we have two main characters in the story, Della and Jim. They have each other, but they don't have much more than that. Still, it's Christmas and each wants the best for the other. So, how much will each one give to make sure that the other will have a Merry Christmas? Right. So, story takes place around Christmas time. Obviously, our seasons don't match up here with the season in the story and when we're reading it, but still a great story nonetheless, and a good example of what we're talking about with authors using certain literary devices to portray love, right? So the big thing about the Gift of the Magi is it is a really great example of situational irony, right? Situational irony occurs when our expectations are contradicted by reality. So in other words, we believe that one thing will happen, but something totally different happens, right? Can anybody think of, you can put it in the chat or you can come off mute, but can anybody think of an example of situational irony, either that's happened to you or that you've seen happen to somebody else or you've seen in a movie or in a show. Um, can anybody think of an example of situational irony before we kind of talk about it a little bit more? You can put it in the chat or you can come off mute. To give you guys an example of what I'm talking about, I always think about, okay, when they made the Titanic, some of you may have seen the movie with Leo DiCaprio, obviously the big ship that hit the iceberg and sunk, right? When they built that ship, it was nicknamed the unsinkable ship because they thought this ship is built so well that it will never ever sink. Right? And then, what happens? It hits the iceberg and it sinks. So that is an example of situational irony where you have this ship named the unsinkable ship and everybody expects it not to sink, but then in reality, it does the exact opposite and it hits an iceberg and sinks and lots of people die. So that will be an example of situational irony. So can anybody else think of one that they've seen in a movie that's happened to them that they heard about, read about? What do you think? What do we think? Any examples come to mind of an ironic situation like that where you think one thing is going to happen, but something else happens instead that's totally different? Kind of like my Titanic example. Anything come to mind? Anything you've seen in a movie or in a show? Anything like that? What do you think? Anything? All right. If not, that is okay because that is what we are going to talk about. And I think maybe when we see this example, it'll kind of jumpstart your brains and you'll think, oh, yeah, I remember something happening kind of like this, right? So here is a passage that, has some situational irony in it, right? Dave was thrilled. He'd just won his first victory as a professional race car driver. Excuse me. He'd been amazing on the track, reaching incredible speeds and carefully avoiding the various wrecks that had taken other drivers out of the race. He couldn't wait to tell his family about his triumph. He was reliving his masterful driving as he pulled into the driveway and hit the family car. All right. So there's our passage. So where is the situational irony in this passage? And to answer that question, we can think about these two things. What do you expect to happen when a professional driver parks a car? And does Dave's situation match those expectations? So, what do we think? Somebody who can answer us in the chat or coming off mute. What is the situational irony in this passage here about Dave? If you're stumped, I would specifically reread this last line here. He was reliving his masterful driving as he pulled into the driveway and hit the family car. So, what do we think? Is there an example of Situational irony there as we see who joins us. Hey, Mira, welcome.
Hey.
We are doing some background of the short story we're about to read called The Gift of the Magi, right? We're talking about situational irony since the story is a really good example of that, right? And we already kind of defined situational irony as something, we believe will happen, but then, something totally different is what actually occurs. And we're trying to figure out, examples of this. And so we have this little passage here, right, that I'll read one more time. And then we want to see if we can pull out what is the situational irony in this passage, right? Dave was thrilled. He just won his first victory as a professional race car driver. He'd been amazing on the track, reaching incredible speeds and carefully avoiding the various wrecks that had taken other drivers out of the race. He couldn't wait to tell his family about his triumph. He was reliving his masterful driving as he pulled into the driveway and hit the family car. So, what do we think is the situational irony in this passage? What do we expect to happen? And, does that match our expectations? If it doesn't, then that's how we know it's ironic. So what do we think? Anybody who can answer us in the chat or off mute? What is the situational irony there? No worries, Sammy. I just saw your chat. I'll try to get a little closer here so it's easier to hear. All right. But again, when we talk about situational irony, we mean, when we believe one thing's going to happen or we expect one thing to happen, but something totally different occurs. So in this passage here, Dave is a professional race car driver. He's just won his first race. He's super excited to tell his family about it, and then he pulls into the driveway and he hits the family car. So where is the irony in this passage? What is the thing that, you know, what we expect to happen isn't what actually happens? Something totally different happens than what we expect to happen. Where do we find the irony in this passage? Anybody who can pull that out? What do we think? Another way to think about it is looking at these two questions. So, what do we expect to happen when a professional race car driver parks a car or drives a car in general? And does Dave's situation match that? So, what do you think? I know we got a light crowd out there, but still a lot of very insightful people with us this morning. So, who can help us out with this? Answer in the chat or come off mute. Where is the irony here? Do we expect a professional driver to hit a car as he's parking it? Or do we expect him to be pretty good at maneuvering and parking a car, etc.? That's what we should be thinking about. So, what do we think? Anybody who has a thought for this? Mira, Ayana, Sammy, anybody who can help us out, put in the chat. Sammy says he just won his first victory as a professional race car driver. He did. All right. So now, if that's the case, because you're on to something here, Sammy, if that's the case, what do we expect him to be able to do when he parks a car? Would we expect him to hit another car, or would we expect him to be really good at parking a car if he's a professional driver? We'd expect him to be good, right? But is that what happens? And again, this doesn't have to be just for Sammy. This can be for anybody. But is that what happens? We expect him to be really good at parking a car because he's a professional driver. But what really happens? What does he do instead? What happens instead when he parks the car? Specifically looking at the last line right here. He was reliving his masterful driving as he pulled into the driveway and hit the family car. So, like Sammy said, we expect him to be good at parking a car because he's a professional driver. But what actually happens instead? Is he good at parking the car or not so good? What happens here in this last line? Is he able to park the car without any scratches on it, or does something else happen? Come on, ladies and gents. I know it's early and it's gray outside, but I know
Can
you're
you
there.
repeat what you just said? Your question over?
Gosh, no worries on it. Yeah, and Sammy kind of helped us answer in the chat, but I was asking, if we know he's a professional driver and we expect professional drivers to be good at parking cars, is that what actually happens, or does something else happen instead that doesn't match those expectations? And Sammy did just tell us in the chat. He said he crashed, which is 100% true. So there is the irony, right? Because we know that situational irony is when what actually happens doesn't match what we expect to happen. So the fact that he is a professional driver, all right, and we expect that he's going to be very skilled at driving and parking cars, etc. All right, doesn't match the reality that he's not so skilled because he hit the family's car on when he was parking his car in the driveway. That is what creates the irony when the reality doesn't match our expectation. All right. So again, we expect a professional driver to be able to park a car very easily, but in reality, he crashes and he can't park the car really easily. So it's ironic that the professional driver has trouble parking his own car, right? So that's what we're talking about when we are talking about situational irony, all right? And like I said, this short story we're about to read, The Gift of the Magi, is one of literature's best examples, most famous examples of situational irony. And this is a little passage from the story that kind of gives us a hint into that, which says, "Now there were two possessions of the James Dillingham Youngs in which they both took a mighty pride. One was Jim's gold watch that had been his father's and his grandfather's. The other was Della's hair." So we're going to see how both of those possessions play into the whole situational irony thing. Right? So now that we have a better example or a better understanding, I should say, of what situational irony is, can anybody think of another example of a situation like that where something ironic happened, where what you expected to happen, something else happened, something that you saw either in a movie or that happened to you, or that you read about, heard about? Can anybody think of another example of situational irony like that before we continue? Like like I said, my example was when they made the Titanic, they called it the unsinkable ship, but in reality, it hit an iceberg and sank, and lots of people died. So the irony is the ship they called unsinkable hits an iceberg and sinks, right? So that would be my example. Can anybody think of another one that they saw that happened to them or somebody else that they read about, heard about? Just to see if we can get one more example of situational irony before we move on here. So that was the question, Sammy. Can anybody think of? And I turned my mic up. Hopefully, you guys can hear me a little bit better. But can anybody think of another example of situational irony? kind of like what happened with Dave here, where he's a professional driver. So we expect him to be good at parking the car, but he actually hits the car while he's parking it. Can we think of one more example like that we know of, that happened to us, happened to somebody else, that we saw in a movie or in a show or read about? Anything? What do we think? No, nothing coming to mind. All right, well, if one does jump out at you, don't be afraid to share it in the chat, okay? So the other thing we have here in the Gift of the Magi, besides the situational irony, is the details that share information about characters, settings, and events, right? These details bring stories to life, often showing more than they tell. We can see that in this little passage here, right? The stuff underlined in red, right, gives us details about the setting that show the residents seem to take pride in their home. And the stuff underlined in blue are details that indicate the neighborhood that they live in may be neglected and run down, maybe not a nice neighborhood, right? Because we can see in the passage here, it says the little house sat on a patch of neatly clipped grass punctuated by a lovingly tended rose bush. Its front walk, freshly swept and bordered by petunias, led to the crumbling crosswalk that separated the yard from the trash-strewn gutter, meaning trash is kind of thrown all about. So we can see the contrast here. And there's going to be a lot of that kind of descriptive imagery going on in the Gift of the Magi, all right? And something we'll kind of do in our checkpoint here is talk about, the significance of a lot of those descriptive details, kind of like this person's already done here, all right? 60 cents of Della's $1.87 is pennies, which kind of shows us how difficult it is for her to save money, all right? Things like that are what we're going to be um, focusing on, right? So, that being said, we will try and transition here into reading the actual short story, getting it started. All right. Questions about anything before we continue? All right. Now I'm going to check my mic here just to make sure. Everybody can hear me okay. All right. So, where you can find a copy of the short story is on Summit, and I just put the code in the chat again, just in case anybody in here still needs to register. Let me share my screen again. Right? But where you can go on Summit when you are registered for this class, Creative Writing Term 4, and then our project is called What is Love, you can see right here, is you can go to checkpoint 1, says Reading Journal, Gift of the Magi, and if you scroll down to the very bottom, you will see something that says Gift of the Magi text, and when you click on that, it will bring up a page that looks like this, okay? And this is where you can access the story when we are not reading it in class, all right? I will be sharing my screen as we read it today for you guys to follow along, but when you're doing this on your own, that's where you can find it, okay? So we're going to start the story today, and then our goal is going to be to have this checkpoint done by Monday, okay? What we're doing on this checkpoint is fairly simple. There's 2 parts here, all right? In the first part, we have several different symbols that we're going to see in the story. All right. And we want to complete the other side of the chart with, what this symbol means. What is its significance in the story? What is it supposed to show us? All right. And then we want to complete the second part, which is kind of following the um, the outline of the plot. So, like you can see, the first part says, "Here's the problem: that Della doesn't have enough money to buy Jim a present for Christmas. What is her solution? What does she plan to do?" You're gonna fill that out, and then continue to fill out the rest of these as we go. And as you read, you'll be able to fill all of these in. Okay. And then lastly, describe how this story is an example of situational irony, which is what we just talked about, where what we expect to happen doesn't match what actually happens. Okay? Questions on any of that so far? Where to find the checkpoint, where to find the story on Summit, what we're going to be doing. Right? I know I'm going through this a little bit fast, but we are recording, so this will be up on the Yes Philly YouTube later today. All right. If I don't hear from anybody, I'm going to assume we're good and there's no questions. So let's do that. So what we're going to try to do today is try and get at least one of these symbols filled out in our chart here. Let me switch to my demo notebook, okay, to give you guys an example of how to fill out this checkpoint. And then you can continue to read the rest of the story and fill out the rest on your own between now and Monday, when this will be due for the first progress report, okay? So, like I said, I'm going to share my screen with the story, all right, if you want to follow along, or you can access it on Summit by going to checkpoint 1, scrolling all the way down, and at the bottom it says Gift of the Magi text. You can pull it up that way as well and have it on your computer, okay? So the first symbol in our chart here is Jim's middle name, Dillingham, on the mailbox. So as we read here, we want to be paying attention and seeing if we can pull out what the significance of that symbol might be. Okay, here we go. $1.87. That was all, and 60 cents of it was in pennies. Pennies saved 1 and 2 at a time by bulldozing the grocer and the vegetable man and the butcher until one's cheeks burned with the silent imputation of parsimony that such close dealing implied. Now, just another little bit of background here. This story was written in kind of the 1900s, 1920s, so we'll see a lot of vocabulary that we don't really see a lot anymore. But as we go through, we'll kind of pick out those words and see what they mean. 3 times Della counted it, $1.87, and the next day would be Christmas. There was clearly nothing to do but flop down on the shabby little couch and howl. So Della did it, which instigates the moral reflection that life is made up of sobs, sniffles, and smiles, with sniffles predominating. While the mistress of the home is gradually subsiding from the first stage to the second meaning sobs to sniffles up here. Take a look at the home. A furnished flat at $8 per week. It did not exactly beggar description, but it certainly had that word on the lookout for the mendicancy squad. So all that means is basically they have a home that is a little bit cheap, and it's kind of right on the edge of somewhere where somebody in poverty would live, based on the way it looks, right? In the vestibule below was a letter box into which no letter would go, and an electric button from which no mortal finger could coax a ring. Also, appertaining thereunto was a card bearing the name Mr. James Dillingham Young. So, meaning on their mailbox, it said Mr. James Dillingham Young. The Dillingham had been flung to the breeze during a former period of prosperity when its possessor, meaning James himself, was being paid $30 per week. Now, when the income was shrunk to $20, though, they were thinking seriously of contracting to a modest and unassuming D. But whenever Mr. James Dillingham Young came home and reached his flat above, he was called Jim and greatly hugged by Mrs. James Dillingham Young, already introduced to you as Della, which is all very good. Right? So now we know the lady in the beginning that's crying is Jim's wife. Right? So if we stop there for now and we go back to our checkpoint and we're trying to fill out this chart, okay, what is the meaning of each of these symbols? All right. The first one is Jim's middle name, Dillingham, on the mailbox. So we want to try and complete this side of the chart and say, all right, what is the significance of this symbol? So if we go back to our story and we reread that part there, right? It says the Dillingham had been flung to the breeze during a former period of prosperity when its possessor was being paid $30 per week. Now, when the income was shrunk to $20, though, they were thinking seriously of contracting to a modest and unassuming D. All right. So, in other words, what they're saying there is, um, when it says contracting to a modest and unassuming D, they're saying they're thinking about, taking out the Dillingham and just putting the D there. So, what do we think is the cause of them wanting to kind of take out his middle name from the mailbox? What's just happened to Jim that might cause them to kind of rethink the way it is on the mailbox? What's just happened to him that might make times a little tougher or a little tighter as we're looking at this paragraph right here? What's just happened with Jim's income? Anybody who is out there that can help us out, either come off mute, answer in the chat. But hopefully we have a few people still with us out there. As we look at this paragraph right here, what's just happened to Jim's income? Has it gone up or gone down? What do we think? Anybody who is following along or who can hear me and answer in the chat or come off mute? If we're looking at this paragraph right here, what's happened to Jim's income? Has it gone up or gone down? Oh, excuse me. What do we think? Anybody with a thought out there? If we reread through this paragraph again, it says the Dillingham, meaning his middle name, had been flung to the breeze during a former period of prosperity when its possessor was being paid $30 per week. Now, when the income was shrunk to $20, though, they were thinking seriously of contracting to a modest and unassuming D. But whenever Mr. James Dillingham Young came home and reached his flat above, he was called Jim and greatly hugged by Mrs. James Dillingham Young, already introduced to you as Della, which was all very good. So, again, what do we hear there? What's happened to James's income? Is he making more money? than he was before, or is he making less money than he was before? What do we think? Is there anyone out there who is still with me, who is still able to give us an answer? All right, so we can see here. I'm going to keep going because I'm hearing silence. So you got to help me help you, folks. Remember that it's a two-way street here. I know it's getting tough getting to the end of the year, but we can still do it. So, like it says right here, when the income was shrunk to $20, so we know he's making less money now. Okay, so they're now that that's happening, they're thinking of changing it to modest and unassuming D. So, you know, what does that tell us? If okay, now he's making less money and they want to take his middle name off the mailbox, what does that tell us about how they think, having the middle name on there help, what they think that shows or how they think that's perceived? you know, do we think having his full name on there is a sign that, they have money, or, is a sign that they don't have money? And also think about the stories taking place kind of in the early 1900s, 1910s, 20s. So think about the idea of, being proper and, stuff like that, that would have taken place back then. So if somebody has their full name on the mailbox like that, do we expect them to be a person with money or to be a person that is poor? What do we think? Any thoughts? Is nobody out there? Have we all fallen back asleep or fallen into the abyss? So we can assume, all right, then, that it'd probably be a person with money, right? Because they're putting their whole name on the mailbox. They can afford to pay for all those letters and things like that. And it's very proper, like Mr. James Dillingham Young, right? Well, now he's making less money. So they're thinking about changing it to just, D instead of his whole full name. So that shows that, now they have to kind of pinch pennies and, be a little tighter with things because they're not making a lot of money. Right. And, kind of having his full name on the mailbox, giving that impression that they have a lot of money. That's not the case anymore. So, maybe they should take it off. So, what we would do here now is we would go back to our checkpoint, right? Not that one. We'd go back to our checkpoint and we would look at this chart, okay? And again, we're trying to fill in what is the significance for each of these symbols, okay? And if I was doing this first one, again, as an example, Jim's middle name, Dillingham, on the mailbox, we could say the meaning here is that having his middle name on the mailbox gives the impression that they have money. So wanting to change it to just D implies that they are now worse off financially than they were before. Okay. So that would be how I could start to fill out this chart. All right. And then I would continue to do that same thing for the rest of these. All right. And as we continue reading on here, we will kind of get through some of the rest of that stuff. All right. Della finished her cry and attended to her cheeks with a powder rag. She stood by the window and looked out dully at a gray cat walking a gray fence in a gray backyard. Tomorrow would be Christmas Day, and she had only $1.87 with which to buy Jim a present. She had been saving every penny she could for months, with this result. $20 a week doesn't go so far. Expenses had been greater than she had calculated. They always are. Only $1.87 to buy a present for Jim, her Jim. Many a happy hour she had spent planning for something nice for him, something fine and rare and sterling, something just a little bit near to being worthy of the honor of being owed by Jim. So going back to our do now question at the beginning, what would you sacrifice for someone you cared about? We can tell how much she kind of cares about Jim here because she's so worried that she doesn't have enough money to buy him a present, right? And we also see the next symbol on our chart here, a gray cat walking a gray fence in a gray backyard, right? So we see those three gray things in a row. So much like the weather is outside today. So then we would fill out, okay, what is the meaning of those symbols, right? What does all that gray kind of imply about, you know, where they live, how Della's feeling right now, all that sort of stuff. That's what we would be thinking about as we continue throughout this chart here. Okay. So, ladies and gents, we will stop there today since yeah, no worries, Sammy. I just saw your chat. So we will stop there today. Um, I know some of you are kind of out and about as you're in class, so it's having a little trouble hearing me, it seems, based on the chat. But um, what I would like you to do for Monday is to do your best to try and read through the rest of that story. It's not very long, and I'll share my screen here and show you. Read through the rest of that story and complete the rest of this checkpoint, okay? So you're filling out the rest of this chart the same way I did the first one. And then you're filling out these lines right here as you read through and see what the plot is, okay? And then lastly, again, how is this story an example of situational irony, okay? And again, you can access the story on Summit under checkpoint 1 if you scroll down to where it says the gift of the Magi text, okay? And then you can read through the rest of the story. Again, not super long, all right? So shouldn't take you too long to get through, all right? And then once you finish, fill out the checkpoint, submit that, and then you are good to go and on track for progress report number 1, okay? So that's what I'm going to look to see from you on Monday, and then we'll go from there and kind of see where everybody's at with this, all right? The recording of this class is going to be up on YouTube, so you can watch it later to kind of refresh how to go through this stuff. And I will also be available in the Summit Lab, okay? Ayana, if you're not assigned to it, it's because you just registered. So I will go in on Summit now and assign you to it, all right? And then if you refresh your page, it should be able to come up. All right?
Can you repeat what you said we gotta do for number 1? For checkpoint 1?
So all you're doing, Tehran, is just reading through that short story and then filling out the chart and the kind of blanks in on checkpoint 1. And there's directions on there, pretty self-explanatory. If you're stumped as you go through, you shoot me an email, you can come see me in the Summit Lab, or you can watch the recording of this class that'll be up on YouTube later today. Okay?
Okay.
All right. Ladies and gents, I do want to give a little kind of PSA that if you are in class, all right, you should be here to participate and engage just like we would in the building. Now, I know some of you, like you said, are in kind of places where it's a little bit noisy it's hard to hear, because we're doing other things while we're in class. But, I'm here as your other teachers are every day, ready to give you a lesson. So we expect you guys to be here ready to kind of contribute to that lesson. So, when I ask questions and it's silent, nobody's answering, and then all of a sudden, when we're about to wrap up, now everybody's filling up the chat with, okay, what do we have to do? I'm not assigned the checkpoint, but that tells me that you're still here and still listening, but you're only responding when it's, okay, I would need to know what to do. But if we're responding and engaging as the whole lesson's going on, it makes everything way easier because it's less of me talking at you guys and more of us talking together. And that's how we learn much better. All right. So just keep that in mind. Hopefully we can be better about it when we come back on Monday. Okay. But yes, I'll assign you, refresh your page, and then you should have it. The rest of us be working on reading that story, completing the checkpoint for Monday for the progress report, and then I will see you then. Okay. Have a great weekend. Stay safe. And again, I'll see you on Monday. Okay. Thank you guys.